All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully some more people will join us as we're going through. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys so you can see the PowerPoint. Okay, and you. Okay, hopefully you guys can all see that. You're just seeing the slides now. If you have any issues, please let me know in the chat screen. I'll try to monitor that as we go. Also, if you have any questions as we're working our way through the PowerPoint, also just put them in the chat and I will try to pay attention to that and answer those as they come up. So first I wanted to say thank you to JTNN for this opportunity to go through this presentation, and also to all of you that are here to get this information on these life-saving chemicals. So today we're going to be talking about opioid misuse and abuse and what you can do about it. A bit about me, my name's Austin Bourne. I'm a volunteer for JTNN. I grew up in Reno. I started my educational career at UNR. I finished up at UNLV with a master's in neuroscience, and now I'm getting ready for med school. So I have some time to volunteer for some wonderful agencies like JTNN. And this issue is very close to my heart as I've been part of the recovery community for several years. Okay, so a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. If I can get to the next slide. All right, so we'll start out discussing what an opioid is, just looking at the chemical compound and seeing how it impacts the end user. And then we'll move into some statistics talking about opioid misuse and abuse in Nevada. And then we'll start looking at the overdoses on an individual level. So what does it look like when an individual is overdosing? And then we'll go into what you can do about it, really why we're here today to talk about naloxone and Narcan. And so I'll demonstrate to you how we use these different compounds. And finally, we'll finish up talking about some of the laws that have been put into place for anybody that needs to administer these compounds. All right, so let's go. Okay, so first question, what is an opioid? Very simply stated, an opioid is a naturally occurring compound. This is its chemical structure here, looks kind of technical and intimidating, but we want to just keep in mind this is a naturally occurring compound that is going to be derived from the poppy plant, which we'll get to look at on the next slide. Now, when an individual ingests this naturally occurring compound, it's going to enter into their central nervous system or their brain, where it's going to act on a set of receptors, mu-opioid receptors, which have evolved specifically to respond to these opioid compounds. And so it's going to work to depress the central nervous system. It's going to slow everything down. So the way I like to think about different compounds is the analogy of a dimmer switch. So if we think of the individual as a dimmer switch, if they take something like methamphetamine, this is speed, right? It's going to turn them up. That dial is going to go up all the way. They're going to be very awake. If they overdose, they might have something like a cardiac event. Now, if you take an opioid, we're going to have the opposite response. We're going to be turning that dimmer switch down. So we're going to be headed towards sedation and sleep. And if we go too far, we get into the overdose range. Breathing can stop and death can occur. So that's sort of what happens when an individual takes an opioid. So our next question is, what kind of opioids are available to these people? And we're going to see that there's going to be natural, semi-synthetic, and fully synthetic opioids. And one of the reasons we want to understand these different classes is that each class has a slightly different risk profile, with the more synthetic ones being more addictive and a little bit more dangerous. So on the natural end of things, we've got classes of drugs including morphine and codeine, very common drugs you may have been prescribed throughout your lifetime. And when we say that they're natural, what we mean is that we're not changing that chemical structure much from when we derive it from the poppy to when the person is actually ingesting it. Now, don't mistake me, I'm not saying that the natural ones are safe or non-addictive, they're just going to be less addictive than the fully synthetic. Now moving up the scale to the semi-synthetic, scientists are going to take that naturally occurring compound into their lab. They're going to add a couple of hydroxyl groups we can see in red here. So this is a small structural change, right, overall, but it has a very big effect on the end user. And so this class of drugs is going to be heroin, hydrocodone, and oxycodone. And again, we're moving up that scale of risk of overdose. And our highest risk is going to be these fully synthetics. And so although these chemical compounds, they might sort of look like the natural compounds, they're not derived from natural compounds in any way. They're just created in a laboratory. So these are going to include drugs fentanyl, methadone, and tramadol. And a good example of how powerful these drugs are is fentanyl. If you give an uninitiated user 2 grains of fentanyl, the size of sand, it can cause an overdose. So very powerful drugs, and we'll see how that has sort of changed the scene of overdose as they've come on board. Okay, so opiate misuse is related to death. So here we're going to look at how significant overdoses are. So here we're looking at a graph from the CDC where we're looking at deaths per 100,000 from 1999 to 2018. And if we look at the green line, this is all opiate deaths summed together. And we can see starting right around 2013, we're getting an exponential growth in overdose death. And this mirrors really well what we call the opioid crisis in America. So this is a problem that has been on the rise for the last, 8 years or so. And the other important piece of data to pull out of here, if we look at heroin and commonly prescribed opioids, we see that used to take up a large part of the pie of causing deaths by overdose. But as synthetics became more available in 2015, they very quickly overshadowed those. So again, we see that these are very dangerous compounds. So that's sort of how things are going in America overall. So now we're going to look at what are the risk factors for overdose within an individual. So I've got several listed here, and we'll just go through each of them, giving you sort of an example or scenario of each. So one time an individual with a past history of opiate use is at a high risk for overdose is when they're discharged from rehab. So what happens in this situation, they're addicted to, let's say, heroin, they have a tolerance for heroin, they go into rehab, they get clean, that tolerance goes away. So they get back out onto the street, and let's say that they relapse. They might think that they can take the same amount of heroin that they used to, but that can lead to an accidental overdose. So this is a very high-risk time for that individual. Another situation that commonly leads to accidental overdose is the intravenous route of administration. This is just because you can get a lot of drug into your system very quickly without realizing how much you've taken. So if that individual was smoking heroin or if they were taking pills, they would either pass out or maybe vomit up some of those pills. But here, you're stuck with the dose that you give yourself. So you get a very easy accidental overdose. Next up is mixing drugs. This is a very common problem with opioids. So again, if you picture that mu receptor, we've got receptor sites for the opioid compound, but there's many other receptor sites within that receptor. And so if we have something like a benzodiazepine, like Xanax, also binding to that receptor, working to also suppress the central nervous system, we can have what's known as a synergistic effect. So those two drugs act together, and now you're at a high risk for overdose. An example of this would be the actor Heath Ledger. His death was caused by accidental overdose by mixing two drugs. Using alone is a very clear risk factor. If you don't have somebody there to apply naloxone or call for help, you're much more likely to run into some trouble. Unknown purity is a problem that is on the rise as synthetic opioids have become more available. Street level dealers have glommed onto this idea that fentanyl is more addictive than heroin alone, and they've started to spike street heroin with fentanyl. So the end user could get some heroin thinking they know what they're getting when really they're getting a very powerful chemical. Other medication ties right back into mixing drugs. So let's say your doctor prescribes you some Xanax and you're taking it as prescribed, but then you end up taking an opiate, you again could have that synergistic effect. The last one here has a funny name, the home cage effect. The reason why is it was discovered by neuroscientists studying mice. And what they found is if they took a mouse on day one, and in its home cage, they gave it some heroin and measured how high it was, and then waited 24 hours and moved the mouse anywhere else in the laboratory, gave it the same amount of drug, that animal would actually get higher. And this is a really important phenomenon because we see it mirrored in the human population. So it's much more common for an individual who uses opioids to overdose away from home than at home. And it's because of this home cage effect. And there's many complex mechanisms at action here, but we believe it's mostly psychological. So when a user is at home, they have these expectations. I'm going to get high, and then that sickness is going to return, and that's what's going to happen. But when they're away from home, those expectations are gone, and it actually changes the physiological response. They get higher, and they're at a higher risk for overdose. Okay, so those are some of the primary risk factors that can lead somebody to having an overdose. Slide. So what are some of the signs and symptoms of an opioid overdose? So you walk into a room, you see somebody, how do you know that they're overdosing? Well, in general, what you're going to see is unusual sleepiness. And what do we mean by unusual? It means that if you went over and you shook them, you tried to wake them up, you're either going to get no response from them or a very muted response. And this is because their body has generally started to shut down at this point. Their breathing will be slowed or absent. Those regions in their brain are suppressed, so the breathing is going to suppress. This is going to cause slower heartbeat and low blood pressure. And now that we have less oxygen coming in, our blood is not oxygenated, so we start to see that the skin feels cold and clammy. The lips can turn blue. So really, those should be enough signs to let you know that somebody's overdosing on an opiate of some type. But if you're still having some doubts, you can pry their eyes open. Most likely their eyes will be closed, and look for what we call a pinpoint pupil. This is a classic sign of opiate use. Okay, so let's say you walk into a room, somebody's displaying all these symptoms, you could think, oh my gosh, they're overdosing. What can I do here? And really, again, this is what we're here to talk about. You can save their life. You can save their life by applying either naloxone or Narcan. So we're going to be talking both about naloxone and Narcan. Realize that naloxone was the compound designed to stop an overdose, and Narcan is the generic, and so they do the same thing. They both stop an overdose, but they have slightly different routes of administration, which we'll look at coming up next. But what happens in the brain? How is this stopping an overdose? So if we look at this image, these little upside down Christmas trees, they represent opioid receptors. These gray molecules are opioids, and these green are Narcan. And once you get Narcan on board, what we basically have here is a game of musical chairs. Both this opiate molecule and this Narcan, they're both fighting for the same receptor site. But luckily for us, Narcan has a stronger binding affinity, so it's going to win out. It's going to block out that binding site, but it's not going to have that depressing effect that the opiate molecule does. So what we're going to see is that within 2 to 3 minutes, this person is going to revive. They're going to start breathing, they're going to wake up, they're going to be able to talk to you. Now, something to keep in mind is that Narcan is going to be cleared out of the brain in about 20 minutes. So if you give somebody who's overdosed some Narcan, about 20 minutes later, they're getting sleepy, they look like they're going back into an overdose, that would be a time to apply a second dose of either Narcan or naloxone. Okay, so who can administer these life-saving drugs? Absolutely anybody. You can, your loved ones can, anybody who has the general training. That's what these compounds were designed for. So on this slide, what we're going to look at is the general steps for applying naloxone or Narcan, and then we'll look how it's different depending on the route of administration. So our first step is going to be to check breathing and pulse to make sure that the neck is straight and airway is clear. So this is going to be the first step in almost any emergency situation. You want to make sure that the person can breathe. If they can't breathe, they're not going to likely have time make it until emergency help arrives. So in order to make sure this person's breathing, you're going to want to clear the airway, which we can see this person doing here by simply tilting the chin back And he's also making sure that the person is breathing at the same time. He's listening for breaths. He's also watching the chest for rising and falling. So once you've confirmed that, that's when you would want to walk away from the person and go call emergency personnel so that they're on their way. So then if you're trained, you can begin doing CPR. If you're not trained, it's fine to skip this step and go directly to administering Narcan or naloxone. Once you've administered one of these compounds, hopefully this person will wake up and be responsive. If they're not, you're going to want to continue CPR until help arrives. So that's the general overview of what you do when you find somebody overdosing. Now we'll look at the different routes of administration. So if you have naloxone, the non-generic form, it's going to be an injectable form. So our first step here is going to be to read the directions and aspirate the appropriate dose into the syringe. Now, if this sounds intimidating to you, if you've never done this before, they do sell Narcan doses that come preloaded accurately in a syringe. But if this isn't something that intimidates you, this is, again, not that hard to do, but I would read the directions before you're in an overdose situation trying to figure that out. Okay, so once we have the right dose loaded up, what we're looking for here is an intramuscular injection. So we just want to get the compound into any major muscle group across the body. So some primary candidates are going to be the upper shoulder or the upper thigh. But if you, let's say they're laying on their stomach and you can't get there, their buttocks would be fine. Really, any major muscle, the compound will distribute through the body, the person will begin to wake up. And this is really an easy injection to give because it's intramuscular. We don't have to worry about depth. You want to push the needle all the way in until it hits the plastic part of the syringe, and it's totally fine to go through close. Okay, so that's the injectable route. Now we'll look at the intranasal route, which comes with Narcan. So Narcan, this is going to be easier. You don't have to do an injection, but it's going to be really important that the person's airway is clear in this situation because it is their airway that is the route of administration. We need it to go up their nose, coat their whole nasal cavity, and go down into their lungs. So the first thing you're going to want to do is lay the person on their back and make sure that their airway is clear. The next step is basically you want to administer that entire bottle into that overdose person. So you're going to put the nozzle up the person's nostril and then press the depressor all the way down. And then you're going to want to linger inside the nostril for a couple seconds so that you make sure that everything is absorbed into the body. Finally, if the person is not improving after 2 to 3 minutes, it's very safe to administer another dose. So these are our two different options. Narcan, you are a little bit more likely to miss the dose if the airway is not clear. With the naloxone, it's a little bit harder with the injection. So you kind of have to make your decisions there. Okay, final question you might be asking yourself is, all right, I'm in a situation, I saved somebody's life with Narcan. What are the laws surrounding this? Am I at any risk? And the answer is you're not at much risk because Nevada has put in a set of laws that are designed to protect the helping individual. The helping individual is defined as anybody who is giving Narcan or naloxone or transporting the overdose person to the hospital. So in this situation, you would be protected by these laws. Another reason we have these laws in place is very often the person there to help the overdosing individual is a user themselves. So we want to protect that person. So if you happen to have controlled substances on you or you're breaking any parole or probation violations, you will not be prosecuted for those issues. Also, if it comes back to your professional life that you ended up using Narcan in some situation, it would be illegal for your place of business to take any action against you. One important note, these laws do not protect the helping individual from child protection laws, so those will still be honored. Okay, so quick overview, a lot of information is in a few short slides. But if you find yourself in an overdose situation, first call 911 and stay with that person until emergency personnel arrives. If you're trained in CPR or you have Narcan or naloxone on hand, that is the time that you're going to want to apply those compounds. And finally, just as a note, if you use opioids or your loved one use opioids, please obtain some Narcan and Naloxone and just have them around the house. Train people that you live with how to use them, make sure they know where it is. These situations, overdose situations, happen very quickly, so you want to make sure that you're prepared for it when they arise. So after all that information, if you're wanting to get yourself some Narcan or Naloxone, you can go ahead and give JTNN a call. Even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, they have figured out a system that you can still go and get a Narcan kit for free. So go ahead and give them a call. Another option, if you're living in Reno, would be Northern Nevada Hopes. They also have this, these compounds, and you don't need a prescription in order to get them. And these last couple slides are just works cited. So I guess I'll close this and stop my screen share and look at the chat and see if there's any questions. Okay, well, I guess we're done. I'll leave this on for a couple minutes if anybody wants to ask questions or whatever. Thank you guys. This is my first presentation I've ever done from my home, so it's good times.